Hey, I'm Dan Karaty, and thanks for checking out my podcast, If I'm Being Honest. Each episode, I will talk with my guests about different obstacles they have faced in life and in their careers. We will talk addiction and recovery, and ultimately, finding a good place to be. Let's get started. All right, welcome back to the podcast, If I'm Being Honest. Today's guest is Robert Kanter. Welcome to the podcast, Robert.
It's an honor and privilege, Dan. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me. You're an international media commentator, and correct me if I'm wrong. You specialize in the fentanyl epidemic.
The opioid epidemic, but specifically now because fentanyl is raging on the streets. It's pretty much what I talk about. So I guess you could say I specialize it, but the research and the television interviews have really been centered around what's happening with fentanyl and just the lethality of it. And so, so that's pretty much what I've been talking about, I guess, for almost the last year, since it's just become such a public health emergency, which is really what it is.
Yeah, and you mentioned the television interviews. You know, I've seen you on TV doing various interviews, but you're always forced to keep it short on there. You only get so much time on different news programs. So I'm interested in digging in and hearing more about it. I know you're a recovery advocate as well, and you have your own personal story of recovery. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to start there and just, get a little bit of your background and what led you to where you are today.
Okay. Sounds like a plan. I'll actually start when I was 28 years old and I was beginning to reach the vertex of my drug use, or I will say substance use disorder, because I try to be politically correct at this point, changing the language, to address the stigma. And I was running a business. I started out of my apartment in Houston. I'd moved from New York with my girlfriend at the time in the 900 telephone industry. I don't know, you're kind of a young guy. I don't know if you remember the 900 telephone numbers.
A little bit.
Pretty much a porn industry. Yeah. You have an 800 number where it's a free call, and the 900 numbers, you'd pay a fee per minute, and it was very unregulated, so you could pretty much run any kind of program on that you wanted. So I became very big at that. Also, my substance use disorder was getting out of control. And I was asked to appear as a guest on the Geraldo Rivera show. And I had been up, Dan, for about a day and a half, and I was just blasted out of my mind, having used Coke and tequila, and I couldn't even see the audience. That's how far, that's how much out of it that I was. But there's a reason I'm bringing it up, which is, here I am in the throes of my substance use disorder, and I'm in the porn business, and there was a mother on the panel who's furious because her son is running up these bills. And so here I am pitted against, this mother. And I've, thank God, through my journey of recovery, I've come to a point where I am sober now and I work with these families, so I always use that as a reference point. I was born in Brownsville, Brooklyn. It was a rough area. It was a rough area. So I was beat up a lot, and I was molested, and lost my father at 16, from emphysema, never had a relationship with him, and, all that stuff. And I used to think I had a victimhood, and I didn't. I had a childhood, and life is going to do what it's going to do. Sometimes it's just the way the cookie crumbles, and it's, it's really not what happens to you, as they say, it's what you do with it, And after that Geraldo show where I humiliated myself, and I can't tell you how much shame was attached to that. And shame, as you know, is a big thing in recovery, too. It's a big thing that we address in recovery. I just found myself in that bottomless pit of despair. Couldn't decide if I wanted to get drunk more than I wanted to get high. And I showed up to a 12-step program, an abstinence-based program, and I got sober, and still sober today. And about 5 years ago, my daughter developed a very severe heroin problem and was locked in an apartment, snorting cocaine with her drug dealing boyfriend, and she wasn't coming out. And you can imagine, as my only child, the thoughts that went through my mind on how to resolve this. But in the past, and maybe this contributed to her use, I don't know, my wife at the time and I came from a place of stigma, a place of punishment. We're disowning you, you're not part of the family, and so forth. And I had read about the Portugal model of harm reduction, which I don't know if you know about it, but about 20 years ago, Portugal, the country, had a very severe heroin epidemic, and they took a bold move and they removed addressing the issue from their criminal justice system into their Ministry of Health. And anyone caught with less than a 10-day supply of drugs was not arrested. They were given a summons, but they were required to appear in what's called a dissuasion committee, which was an attorney, a physician, a social worker. They work with that individual. They met them where they were, They came from a place of compassion. They gave them what we call now harm reduction tools. They directed them to treatment. But if they weren't ready to get to make that decision, they focused on their safety. You know, safe injection sites, which are controversial now in this country, have been around for a long time. They reduced their epidemic by 75%, taking that approach. You could call it partial decriminalization. Mm-hmm. So I said to my wife, why don't we take this approach? We convinced my daughter to come to a diner. She was out of it. And we took this approach. And she will tell you, and I take no responsibility for her sobriety, that based on that conversation, she left, she threw all her crap in her belongings in a black garbage bag, came back and allowed us to drive her to detox. And she stayed in detox for 5 days. Didn't, what these kids call today, spin dry, went directly to a 28-day inpatient facility, went to sober living, and is in her 5th year of sobriety now and is doing great.
Wow.
Thank God.
How many years are you sober?
I'm in my 18th year now.
18th year.
Yeah.
If I can just take you back really, really quick, did you have any kind of incident or anything that, you said you got to your bottom and you ended up going into a 12-step program. Was there anything that kind of forced you in there, or did you just get to a point where you had enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was locked in a hotel room doing a massive amount of cocaine, and I had remembered when I was in the emergency room, it was many times, and the doctor said, we have men your age coming in having strokes with the amount of drugs and alcohol that you're drinking. So I'm locked in this hotel room, and I couldn't stop. And I said to myself, Rob, if you don't stop, your heart's pounding out of your chest, you're going to have a heart attack. You're going to stroke. And I couldn't stop. And I knew then that, it was like, you talk about your life being unmanageable. It was at the unbearable stage now. It was like, if I don't do something, I will absolutely kill myself. And my daughter's going to be coming to my gravesite, not the opposite. So that's what got me to, I always say I came to the 12-step fellowship to check it out, to see what the fuss was about, to leave. I just wanted to go to leave so I could say I went. And some kind of magic happened that first meeting. And really the magic was that I didn't know anything from anything about this program, but I could see that people sharing honestly about their struggles and the tools had something to do with recovery. Like that much I could deduce. Mm-hmm. And that's what got me to come back. And there was a relapse in there. I had actually 10 years of sobriety, and then I went out, for 3, and the crack houses, the shooting galleries, the S&M dungeons. I mean, a life of the unspeakable. And now I'm back, thank God. Christmas Eve was 17 years. So yes, to answer your question, there was an incident that shook me up, that took me out of that hallway from not knowing which door to walk into. Did I want to get sober more than, did I want to get high? So, they talk about that being grateful for your, that bottom that you reach. And I do have that gratitude. Okay. So, yeah.
So, you carry that experience into adulthood, and into parenthood. I found it interesting because of your experience with drug use and alcohol. When you started having those difficulties with your daughter, you mentioned how you at first came from a place of punishment, right? Which I think a lot of parents do. What do you think? And, always I've talked to some younger, young adults as well, trying to figure out, what's the best way to try to handle, when you have kids going through a situation like that. Having had your own experience, what made you go the punishment route first, do you think?
Lack of knowledge and stigma. I was living in the stigma. I was more concerned. My wife was more concerned with what other people thought, the neighbors down the block. our family members, keeping up with the Joneses. And as we researched it, we came to the point, and I had experience in this, but as we still researched it, we understood that coming from a place of compassion was more effective, and that this is someone that's suffering. They haven't decided, you know what, I want to screw up my life. These are sick people, and some of them are ready to get better, and some of them are not. And as we did more research, we learned about, the different options that are out there. The essence was, we talk about one alcoholic talking to another. There's something magical. It was having a loving, destigmatized conversation. It really was that conversation that opened my daughter's eyes and said, oh, she does have compassion for me. They do love me. They understand what's happening. And that's a key piece, is to understand what's happening on the streets. What's tranq? Well, they're mixing xylazine with fentanyl right now. When you know this, that you're coming to where they're at. Instead of being the parent, you're being someone that understands that they're suffering. And that, I believe, opened up that trust factor that she could say, okay, there was authenticity there.
Yeah.
They really want me to get well. They understand what's happening. There isn't that disconnect or that generation gap. Okay, let me trust my parents, because we always, because of the way we treated her, we were part of the problem, not part of the solution. A loving, destigmatized conversation with authenticity, I think, is really where you start, with boundaries. Don't get me wrong. You're not going to let your kid come into the, into the living room and shoot heroin and watch Netflix, obviously. But taking that approach is what worked for us. And when I advocate, that's really what I talk about, is understanding you might have grown up as an adult now living in the stigma, using the words I won't even use that are stigmatizing. Understand that there's a different path that you can take here to assist your child in getting well. Then you keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah, and it's awesome that you guys have both found sobriety. In helping her, how you talk about being authentic and open and compassionate. Did you share your stories with her?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And and that was another thing, and you don't have to be in recovery from SUD to share a personal story with your child. You can talk about something in your childhood that happened that was traumatic. Now, it's personal to each parent, obviously. I got a little more down and dirty with my daughter, and that was another thing. I said, listen, I spent time in crack houses. I, took money that should have gone to your college education and put it up my nose. I'm no angel here, and that honest, authentic conversation where she's like, whoa, I didn't know that. I appreciate you telling me that. You wouldn't be telling me this if you didn't love me. Mm-hmm. This whole different approach, not living in the stigma, more of, I keep using that word, authentic, more of a realistic conversation, which probably before most parents haven't had with their kid. I'm not going to say that a young adult, their use is about their childhood. It could contribute, we don't really know, but this bottom for her is an opportunity for the family to come together and have these conversations. They're very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I have two young kids, right? So I still haven't decided when or how I'm going to have my, first conversations with them. But one thing I've promised myself is the ugly that I have lived, I'm going to share with them, because I think it's important for them to know where drinking took me. And, not that that's going to happen to them, but I think they should know. And, as you said, I think if I can get honest with them about that and share some of that ugly, maybe that opens the door for them feeling comfortable to be honest back.
And that's exactly correct. You'd rather them come to you and say, Dad, I tried this substance and I'm starting to like it, but, you told me what you went through. I'd like to talk to you about it. Is it really a big deal? You've already set that precedent where they can come to you. It's exactly what you want. You don't want them on the streets. You don't want them in a crack house. You want them to be able to come to their parents, and the love has to be there. and the knowledge has to be there. So I really, when I talk about like family legislation or anything like that, I stress that these conversations are critical.
Yeah. So
and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to have them. Don't be, just because your child is suffering right now doesn't mean your next door neighbor his child isn't suffering. You just don't know about it. You're not the one with you're not the family with the character flaws here. Trust me. If we're under a public health emergency with the fentanyl epidemic, there's a couple of other people's kids that are in this into this too. So
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure. I mean, your experience has found this as well. The more I have opened up and been willing to share, the people that come out of the woodwork, like you were just saying, all around you. Who are having some sort of difficulties, whether it's with family or friends or, someone around them. We're all affected by this in one way or another. So, just not being afraid to say things out loud and, fight against that stigma, as you said, it opens the conversation for so many people and makes so much more possible, which is kind of where I want to go with you now is, you've gotten into being a recovery advocate now and commentating on, the fentanyl epidemic that we all face. How did you get into this line of work?
So I started volunteering first for an organization in New York City, as a parent coach, just basically kind of doing what we just discussed. And I was invited to a press conference in Long Island where legislation was introduced by a senator called the Family Support Services for Addiction Act. Monies, because this is a family disease, right? The people we hurt the most are the people we love the most. Mm-hmm. Monies for families, support services, what they call systems navigation, to understand rehabs and, how that whole process works. And unbeknownst to me, the people at this nonprofit that I was volunteering for told the senator my story. And I'm just sitting there minding my own business. And she gets at the podium and she's like, Mr. Kanter, blah, blah, blah. Would you like to come up and say a few words? And I'm like, you fucking kidding me here? I have nothing planned, And I did it. And, like this, I'm just so convinced, Dan, that the script is written in my life. I don't know about anybody else. But so it set off some local media, like a public access interview and some radio stuff. And I said, the leading advocates in the country, Ryan Hampton, Tim Ryan, are not really, even Chris Herron, are not doing anything internationally. They're not carrying that message internationally. They've all done, maybe one or two interviews. So I took that route, and I was interviewed on Canadian national television. And then it became Al Jazeera, and it became TRT World, and not too far back, Russia Television, China Global, and so forth. And I wrote some articles and so forth. And with the plan being I don't have a PR agent and I'm doing this in front of my computer, maybe I'll be fortunate and land an interview in the States. And sure enough, I got a call from Fox and Friends, and there was a DEA event, Drug Enforcement Administration event called Red Ribbon Week. And they invited me on the show, and Steve Doocy introduced me, and that's what happened. And there've been a couple of other interviews. And so here I sit, not really knowing where all this is going to go. I am continually pitching TV stations. I would like to do some public speaking. I've done a little bit. I truly don't know. I'm on a journey where there's no destination. Mm-hmm. I had businesses, Dan. I made a lot of money. I lost the money. I've made some back. But I've never been happier in my life. I'm excited to do this, especially when you see these podcasts of these mothers, fathers that I see it over and over. They talk about turning the pain into purpose. They start these foundations. I think it's wonderful. But I am telling you, I could have gotten that call from the coroner's office. And I take it very personally. It's a passion because it reminds me of how dark the times were with my daughter and the amount of drugs she did, and for that matter, the amount of drugs I was doing. So why did we both survive, and why are we both enjoying this life of sobriety? Well, I'll be damned if I'm going to sit on my ass and not contribute in some way. And if this is meant to be the path, this is meant to be the path, So, and there's things coming up. I'll talk more about in terms of fentanyl and what's happening, with organizations and government organizations. So there are ways other people can get involved. I guess we can talk about that later.
Well, that's kind of, I want to transition to that now if we can, because you talked about yourself in use. I know, I was more of a drinker than anything else, but there were plenty of times in my life where I took an ecstasy pill or I did cocaine with friends and I didn't even think about it. I mean, nothing even crossed my mind, because how dangerous could this be? That's how I felt. Now, this was quite a few years ago. But there was no worry, I think, of what exists now with this fentanyl situation. And I think this is, when I've seen you speak in the past, this is part of what drives you right now, is this fentanyl that's everywhere, that, the first time a kid decides to try something, they could be dead. It's so lethal, so dangerous. What is it that drives you right now? Are these the stories that you're hearing, that's making you want to get up and do this work every day?
Well, part of it is sharing my story. They say when you talk about the shame, you take the power out of it. So hopefully being somewhat of an inspiration, carrying the message of recovering and and this is really the main message I wanted to share with your listeners, is that there are multiple pathways to recovery. And if one doesn't work, there are others. So what I was going to say, Dan, is that as I did these international interviews, some of them started skewing to subject matter. We're on a rainbow fentanyl, or what are dual-use precursor chemicals, and all of this stuff. So I became, in addition to a recovery advocate, I just morphed into a media commentator, so that I would be called either to tell my story or to talk about the nitazines that are popping up now that are stronger than fentanyl, or both, or combining them. That's just the way that I guess you'd say my brand or my message has evolved, right? The problem is with fentanyl, it's not just that it's so lethal. It's the whole landscape of the way it's trafficked in, starting from China and also India, which isn't, and I can go on and on here, but the production of precursor chemicals, and then the politics behind China in this country, going to the cartels, right? There's a number of main cartels, but now they can produce an endless supply of fentanyl. This never happened before. If there was a shortage, you're going to have less overdoses. So now it's not about how much they can produce, it's about how much they can traffic in. Now, these are, besides being vicious criminals, they're also marketers. I mean, they have a pipeline of stuff. It hasn't always been fentanyl. And then you have the stash houses and these central importation spots, and then it goes onto the street and it's cut with who knows what. So, and then you have the internet, right? And then you have Snapchat. It's accessible, it's enormous, and it's anonymous. So in the old days, you had to be face-to-face with someone to get your drugs. And now you can get the drugs on the internet. All these pieces put together is what makes it so challenging and really so frightening. So you have these young adults that are 12 years old on Snapchat or on Facebook, and you have these coded emojis that they're using to purchase these illicit substances, and one and done. It's one and done. It's absolutely incredible. And here's the other thing I want to mention, Dan. It's not just someone that suffers from substance use disorder. What about the gentleman that was always getting his Percocet or Vicodin for his lower back, his chronic back pain, because there was no limitations for physicians to write, controlled substances. And now because it's under prescribing, he can't get them. He's in pain. Well, I'll go on the internet and get some. Or it's the weekend warriors at the music festivals that they don't use drugs, but let's try a Molly because I'm at a Fish concert, and they just don't know. So it's not only my story of recovery, it's trying to disseminate this information to educate, individuals, parents of what we're faced with. I mean, really, it is a crisis. If we lost 500,000 or whatever it is souls to COVID, all right, we've lost over 100,000. So 100 isn't 500, but you know what? It's in the conversation to give you an idea of how serious this is. And it's a scary conversation to have.
Now, it's a very scary conversation to have when you're talking about this whole, like I was that weekend warrior guy when I was in my 20s, who I would just happen to be at a club, and if somebody offered me ecstasy, sure, I'll do it. Not knowing anything about what I was doing. I don't know, even in today's world, and it scares me to even say this, but if I'm 22 years old again, I thought I was invincible when I was 22 years old. Nothing bad was going to happen to me. So is there, and this is, you know, it's a bit of an ignorant question because I don't know, but is there a way to experiment and have your fun, but try to be safe about it? Or are we in a landscape now where you are taking a chance with your life every time you're doing drugs?
Right. There's no more experimentation. That's actually a great word to use. We've lost the option of experimenting with drugs because, again, that's a great word you used also, Dan, feeling invincible. So 5 years ago, even, you could feel invincible. You could, reach some kind of bottom, but this isn't a one and done situation. This is not like, hey, give me a line, let me see the quality of it, and I'll decide how much I want to do. I mean, you got to understand, and I'm sure you understand, we're talking about 7 granules of salt put into an oxy that will cause you to stop breathing. So there's no room anymore for experimentation. I mean, that's actually a great point. It's certainly not an ignorant question because we've lost that. So the problem is, let's say you have someone coming to a 12-step program, 12-step model of recovery, and they're sober a number of years. And back in their day, they could be somewhat invincible. And now they go back on the streets. If they relapse, they still think they're invincible. Mm-hmm. They might smoke a joint or they might do a line of coke, and their thought process, is skewed, and their decision-making is skewed. And, I need that amount that I used to do to get the same high that I had. So, yeah, give me all of that stuff. And obviously the drug dealers couldn't care less about overdoses. Otherwise, the drugs wouldn't be that addicting. But they know that the next individual is right behind them that's going to get addicted very quickly, and that's their next, unfortunately, hate to use the word customer, that's the next customer. It's a pretty sick formula, right? It's really kind of scary.
Yeah, but how do we protect the youth? How what is the message to them? Just abstinence? Because that's tough, right? I think, there's only a certain part of the population who take to that and just say, yeah, okay, I'll swear off drugs. I'll never touch them. I think it's almost unrealistic for us to feel like, getting no kids to do drugs, right? So what is our message to them? How do we make them understand what we're looking at?
Right. So the first thing, we'll go back to Chris Herron, is an educational process to let them know the lethality of what's on the streets right now, that this is no joke, and where they can find it, for example, on the internet. And I think the second thing is what I talked about also, is having these conversations, whether it's with your peers, your parents, your guidance counselor, whomever, having these conversations as well to keep that open channel of trust and dissemination of information. But the other thing, which is what I want to always talk about in a podcast, is understand that if you try one pathway to recovery, and this is part of the education. We used to have, I believe you subscribed to a 12-step model too. Mm-hmm. That was the only thing 5 or 10 years ago that existed. Now there's medication-assisted treatment. There's behavioral therapy. Some people return to their faith, Dan, and are able to find abstinence. So the message is, one size doesn't fit all. If something doesn't work, stand up, brush yourself off, and try something else. Or maybe it's a combination of medication and 12-step, which in of itself is controversial. But maybe it's your faith and behavioral therapy and 12-step. So I can't guarantee, I'm not going to say, well, if I got sober, you're going to get sober. Unless we're joined by an umbilical cord, I can't say that. There's no guarantees. But I can guarantee anybody listening or watching that there are multiple pathways to recovery that you can tap into when you're ready, when you make that decision, that you want to get well more than you want to keep suffering. And that's really good news, right? We never had, buprenorphine or all these other medications. And as you know, there are some controversies over all this stuff, really, what works and what doesn't, but there's plenty out there. So, and the kids, as I'll call them, need to know about this. So if they can come to their parents and if they can understand what treatment is, look at the options you're giving them as opposed to kind of hiding behind a door and then not even knowing that this exists.
Yeah, so, that's huge, like you said, because there are more and more treatment options every day. But, even myself, it was like I avoided treatment for as long as I could because I didn't want to admit to anybody about what I was actually dealing with, about my addiction or, anything negative that was going on in my life. So I think it's, again, it all goes back to one of the main things I always talk about on the podcast is, being willing to talk, being willing to open up to anyone, whether it's a friend or a parent or, anybody in your environment that, just say the word, because someone is around you that can help and get you the help that you might need.
Most of us, as you know, were touched by this, when you're talking about a public health emergency, and especially these young adults like 18 to 29, it's rare if they don't have a friend or a friend of a friend that has either overdosed or is in rehab. It's rare. I mean, because that's the age where they get slammed, I'll also say this, Dan. One of the things we talk about what caused the opioid epidemic and solutions, and it's not important what caused it. It's really the FDA that caused it. It's not Purdue Pharma. It's not these other entities or the pharmacies or whatever. Everyone just jumped along for the ride. But in my humble opinion, the way you're going to reverse an epidemic is not with stricter security at the borders. It's not going after the cartels. It's not access to treatment. It's not funding from Congress. It's media coverage. That's how you're going to begin the process of reversing this. That's why what you're doing is critical. And actually, of all the interviews I've done, Dan, interestingly enough, it's the podcasts where I've gotten the most response from individuals suffering, because we have this opportunity to ask honest questions, have authentic conversations, and connect with someone. Just like you said at the beginning, a 5-minute, 3-minute segment where I'm in the environment of a network and all the politics that go on is not going to get that authentic message out. So the media coverage is huge. And that's why what you're doing is huge. And then a pathway to recovery as well, Dan, is giving back. So I feel I'm giving back. You're giving back right now. Anyone that's suffering, if they're able to, if they give back, if they volunteer for an organization, now they're taking a step toward their recovery. There's something very satisfying. It's something that builds your self-esteem when you're of service. So,
yeah, I think I think what's hard with the media, because I agree with you, the message that would come from the media could really help. I think the problem with the media, and I actually do want some of this from you if you could share it, but the media throws us statistics, right? And they throw us all these big numbers about how much is coming across the border and how many people died, but we don't get personal, right? So it doesn't hit home because we don't get personal. It's unfortunately, like so many things in our lives, we don't pay attention to it until it affects us directly. The scary thing is that something so serious like this, when it affects us directly, it tends to be in the worst possible way, so there's no lead up to it. So I don't know how we meet those two in the middle, because I think it's important for everyone to know how much is coming across the border and how many deaths there are. But again, I think it's the media's responsibility to shine the spotlight on some of the people that are just like your next door neighbor who are suffering from this directly.
Why would a network that, and I won't mention names, that skews to the right right? Because so political, than all the different networks. Why would they waste their time on a story? And they do tell stories when they can bang away the fact that the DEA just busted, another drug cartel, or the numbers go up. And then for that matter, why would the left say the numbers are going down in terms of the overdose fatalities? Okay, they're going down, but they're going down, what, 2,000 from 105 to 100 and whatever it is, 104, 5. They can spin it any way they want. That's one of the unfortunate things about the political environment that we live in. So as a commentator, I got to be careful. If I appear too much on the right side, then that's going to turn off the left side, and that's not easy to do in this environment. But what I will say is this: there are certain networks that cover this all the time, and as political as it is, I'll take the interviews because it's media exposure.
Sure.
So I have to put life and death before politics. Yep. You know what I mean? And there's one network in particular that is covering this issue literally every other day. And you know what? They're covering it every day. What can I tell you? That's where the interviews are, because they're covering it so frequently. That's what we need, Dan, like daily, in-depth coverage, including personal stories and including resources for those suffering, including dissemination of information to educate people on fentanyl and how little it takes. And I'll give you an example. When you go into the office in the DEA in Washington, and I commend them for this, all across the walls are pictures of young adults that have overdosed and died, like it's all over, which means that every time an agent walks through there, they're seeing the lethality of this. You know what I'm saying? So, hey, so do I criticize the DEA, or are they doing a great job? Well, I think they're doing a great job, but I think they could do more. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not taking sides. Unfortunately, the media does. I had someone comment to me yesterday, Dan, that something to do with people would abstain from using alcohol and drugs if this particular network didn't bang away how, whatever. And I'm like, boy, that's a little scary to me to think you'd actually draw that conclusion.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is true. And, the last thing I ever want to do on here is get political, because I think there is enough blame to go around for everybody. And at the same time, as you mentioned, there are a lot of different people trying to do something. But if you can put sort of in view for all the listeners here, how large this problem is. You touched on, it's coming from China and India, but it's coming through the southern border. I know it's coming through other ways, but, how much fentanyl is coming in? How many people are dying from it? And I do want you to put in perspective as well how little it takes of it mixed in with something to actually be a lethal dose.
Right. You see, it's a very complicated scenario. And when you want to blame culpability on Purdue Pharma, or you want to blame culpability on the DEA or the transnational Chinese criminals, or India, or the cartels, all of these, or the drug dealers, when everybody's culpable, Dan, nobody's culpable. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. And so it becomes a very complicated, and social media, it's like it becomes complicated on how you address this. And that's why I go back to the media. We crossed that milestone, the grim milestone of $100,000 overdose deaths. I wish it was $100,000 for a 12-month period ending in this August. The numbers keep getting revised. Sometimes they go up to 106. The last number I heard is 104. Now, they're not politicized numbers, Dan, because they're coming from the CDC. So the CDC really isn't going to lie. But there's there is underreporting of figures because of what's called deaths by investigation. An overdose that occurs, there's a process. It's about, I believe, 4 months that it goes through before it's finalized. So there's a 4-month lag in the actual numbers. Is it a significant number? Let's just call it 100,000. You know what I mean? Let's call it 100,000 poor souls that didn't know what they were consuming, or some of them that did know that are no longer here. It's a tragic, and like I said, I'll go back to it. All of the elements the funding from Congress, and Congress is really doing more than they've ever done. The DEA is doing more than they've ever done. Is the U.S. government doing more? I don't know. I don't know the politics of all of that. Believe it or not, China has cracked down on their chemical manufacturing companies, but are they doing it other ways? You see, there's certain things I can't comment on and certain things I can comment more on. And one of my fears also, Dan, is that when the numbers tick down a little bit from 106 to 104, all of a sudden maybe it's not as top of mind with people. That's a really bad thing. 100 is 100. It's not like it went from 104 to 54. So then you can get some media that manipulates that and says, well, it's getting better. And is it really getting better? And then what's next? There's something called nitazenes, and which are much more lethal than fentanyl, which is showing up now on the streets. It's sold as what's called tranq. It's a xylazine. It's an animal tranquilizer that's mixed with fentanyl. They're not going to stop, Dan. They're not going to stop. I mean, either you treat this like a public health emergency or you don't.
No, so it's like you said, they're not going to stop, right? And they're always a step ahead. It's like the cheaters are always a step ahead as, the scientists to figure out how they're cheating or whatever. So messaging, as you mentioned, is the most important thing. I think, when you talk about treatment, because I do want to spend a little time on treatment, you said there's numerous types of treatment that people can receive. Obviously you have 12-step programs, which I know very well. But these treatments that are like medication based, can you talk a little bit about those? Just because I know nothing about them, and I'm just curious about how effective they are and if they're dangerous or not, and how they work.
Right. So I'll use one called buprenorphine. So something just happened, actually, which was very significant, which was, and this came out a week ago. Prior to a week ago, if a physician wants to prescribe controlled substances, they had to get a waiver from the DEA. And there was a course that they had to take. And there was a lot of red tape. And a lot of them just didn't want to bother. They didn't want to get involved. So legislation was just passed where they've waived that waiver. So that's opening it up for physicians to be able to prescribe these medications. They have been proven to be effective. How effective? Again, there are research studies. My understanding is that they are very effective. But how can you say that a medication going into one person's body is going to have the same effect or result as another?
Yeah.
And so I believe that the medical community is trying their best to come up with, there was just another article in the Pharmacy Times about a potential vaccine, not the one they talked about 6 months ago, but a new one that has been studied that looks very promising. But the problem is the vaccine comes along, and then by that time, the cartels have reinvented themselves. The medications have been proven to be effective. I'm not going to say but they have been proven to be effective. You are under the guidance of a psychiatrist, okay? There's usually behavioral therapy that's involved as well. And so there's a trained medical aspect to this that is very important for a patient's safety. What's worked more than any other pathway to recovery is, it's 12-step, right? Millions of people are successfully in recovery, as I am. That's what I subscribe to. That's worked for me. I haven't had to seek out anything else. So to answer your question, they have been proven to be effective. I suggest individuals explore that if, let's say, a 12-step doesn't work. There are a few, like methadone, buprenorphine, that are legal, and then more is being done and more research is being done. Compared to 12-step, Dan, medications in terms of mass use is really new. Mm-hmm. I mean, they might have been around 10 or 20 years ago, but for the amount that it's being used in the public, it's a relatively new form of treatment. Methadone during the pandemic was, many states allowed it to be delivered to people's homes. Okay, that's a groundbreaking thing as well. But so there's plenty out there, but and again, so just like I say, with all transparency, Dan, the politics of China and transnational and all that criminals is something I don't have the expertise in. So too in the medical space, I can speak only as a layperson and advocate. Mm-hmm. And there are many other people that could speak more intelligently about, more specifically, and the efficacy of these medications.
Yeah. Overall, do you think we're making progress?
100%. 100% we're making progress. In the medical field, we're making progress. In Congress, we're making progress. The grassroots organizations are making progress with access to treatment, especially in marginalized communities. I won't even get into it, how unfair it can be for individual A to get quality treatment and individual B. Mm-hmm. That's another thing that's getting really better. All those areas have absolutely improved. It's unfortunate that it had to get to the level of a public emergency, but they are improving.
Yeah, I think
fentanyl coming over is fentanyl coming over into the country improving? That's a tough one for me to answer. Right? Those others I can. Congress, that information is public. I'm in recovery, so I know the grassroots organizations. There are things I do know and things I don't know. Overall, I think the answer to your question is yes. I mean, listen, the government understands the severity. It's not like their head is in the sand. But what they can do, what they haven't done, that I don't know if we're making progress on. I would hope that we are.
Yeah, I think society as a whole is making progress with this stuff, as we're all opening our eyes and our hearts a bit, and being willing to go back to how we started this whole conversation, just to being willing to talk to each other and ask for help if necessary. The numbers, it's hard. You want to know where the numbers stand, right? I always wonder now, what are the numbers with kids? Are they going down? Are they going up? With overall drug use. I think that's a hard thing to put a number on, isn't it?
The statistic is that the age group of 18, I believe it's 45 or 49, it's in the 40s, is the leading cause of death in this country. So in that, fentanyl is the leading cause of death. Fentanyl-related overdose fatalities, whether it's fentanyl pure, whether it's cut. So that's a staggering number. Mm-hmm. And then the ages of these young, I'll call them kids using, when you're talking about 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds, because again, they're growing up a lot faster than we did, Dan, with the access to information on the internet. I mean, it's amazing what they know that I had no clue about when I was 11 or 12. I mean, I was on the streets playing stickball. I wasn't in front of a computer ordering drugs from, wherever, across the world. Yeah. So I can tell you those numbers have been reported, that it's the leading cause of death. The specific statistics change often. And the problem is, if you want firm statistics, then you're going back, let's say it's a year, whatever the number is, and those can be outdated numbers. You know what I mean? I often wonder how accurate the actual statistics are, because they can be very complicated to compile. Mm-hmm. Death certificates and deaths under investigation, and and what's political and all of this stuff. You know what I mean? So the best source is the Vital Statistics website and the CDC websites, and they have dashboards and they report statistics. That would probably be the most accurate source if individuals are looking for that.
Yeah, the sobering number, though, I mean, the sobering fact is how you just said the leading cause of death in that age group. And to take it back, I mean, it's like I'm a big sports fan, right? And it's always hard to keep doping out of sports, right? Because we always say the cheaters are ahead. Cheaters are ahead of the scientists. They always have to catch up. And unfortunately, even if we fixed the fentanyl situation, like you said, what's next? They're going to come up with something else, right? So talking, messaging, making our kids feel like they can open up to us if they're having a problem, and just trying to let everybody know what the dangers are. Get our heads out of the sand, right? And talk to our kids as much as possible. I think that's the most important thing we could do as a society, right?
Absolutely. And I'll throw in too, January 30th is National Prevention Day, sponsored by SAMHSA, which is the government organization that funds other organizations, part of Health and Human Services, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Mid-May is National Prevention Week. Okay, so Prevention Day is in person in Maryland, across the river from Alexandria, Virginia, if I have it correct. And then National Prevention Day is really geared toward youth. It's geared toward everyone and their community events, and there are school events and so forth. There are ways to get involved. There are ways for individuals and parents to contribute. So let's not just talk to our kids, but what else can we do to contribute? Your local organizations, your task forces, law enforcement organizations, support groups. There are many things individuals can do to contribute to reversing this prolific epidemic. So I hope to be involved in the May event. I'm excited that I hopefully will be, and contribute my story. And as I said before, volunteering is a pathway to recovery. It can be someone's step in the right direction to continue their journey of recovery.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think everybody can help, because we're all affected by this in some way, whether it's, directly, a member of our own family or friends or someone in our community. I mean, this problem is everywhere. There's no getting away from it. So it's important for everyone to get involved.
And
Robert,
I'm telling you, Dan, you're going to be strolling along in your journey of recovery, and boom, the light's going to go off. It's going to be, time to talk to the kids. That's it. It's going to be, it's going to happen like that. Someone's going to say something. You're going to hear it in the 12-step meeting, or maybe it's your faith or whatever it is. And you look at your kid and you say, okay, I think they're ready to understand this. Those conversations are so important.
Absolutely.
I hope that my experience has maybe opened some parents' eyes and to the importance of that discussion.
Oh, I'm sure it has, Robert. And that's what's so great about you being willing to share your story. And, I want to thank you for coming on today, and not just sharing your story, but your experience and, educating me and all the listeners and, everything that we've talked about. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Dan. It's an honor and privilege. Thanks for the coverage. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, be well, and hopefully people will volunteer and we can make some more progress.
Yeah. Best in health to you and your family.
All right. You too. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want more content like this, check out some of my previous guests. You can also go to my website, dankaraty.com, for more talk on my blog, and subscribe to my newsletter for updates on the podcast, more info on addiction and recovery, and everything else that my guests and I are up to.